Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, this video is all about the brutal and sadistic murder of a 14-year-old girl, Mary Clifford. She was murdered by a midwife, Elizabeth Brownrigg. This murder was so sadistic and brutal that even the hardened Londoners at the time were horrified at what had gone on. So before we go into the actual murder, which took place 1767 in the heart of London, the city of London, I'd like to just explain what it was like for a start off. Coal fires, open wood fires, oil lamps in the street. It was very smoky, very murky. Also, the pollution from other sources was disgusting. From the sewers, open sewers. And then something you might be familiar with from some of my other videos is open graves, where in the centre of London they had these cemeteries for the poor where they dug holes 5 coffins wide and they kept them open until they'd filled the hole, and then grave robbers. So there was this disgusting stench of pollution around this part of London at the time. So we're not looking at a nice Oliver Twist Hollywood London. We're looking at a grey, murky, almost lawless part of the world. So in amongst all of this pollution and poverty surrounding this area, you have the Brownrigg family. Now, James Brownrigg lived in Fetter Lane in the city of London. He was a plumber and house painter, so he had the two trades. He took in apprentices. He lived with his wife, Elizabeth Brownrigg, and their son, John. They had another son and a daughter. In fact, Elizabeth had given birth to 16 children, but only 3 had survived. So this put her in good stead for her trade as a midwife and also a layer out of the dead. So if somebody died in your family, you called out Elizabeth, she'd come along and she would lay out the corpse and clean it and all that kind of stuff. Now, their house was quite prosperous. It was a large house, and the upper story, they rented out rooms, so they took in lodgers. They also had their own male apprentices to help James Brownrigg in his work. Elizabeth Brownrigg, she could take in apprentices, but the apprentices that she could take in were foundling children from the workhouse. Now, the workhouse, they were quite small establishments, except for one, which was not far away, which was Bridewell. Bridewell was both prison, hospital and workhouse. And what had happened here was there'd been a bit of a disagreement some years before, where the authorities were saying, are we overeducating these foundlings? Are we teaching them too much? Surely they should have a different kind of education, and vocational, where they can learn to be like a maid or something. So they come up with the idea that you could apprentice a foundling, boy or girl. And you took them on a month's approval, and if they were suitable, you then signed the documents and you had them for 2 years. You're teaching them a trade. And this is where it leads to the horrendous treatment of Mary Jones, Mary Mitchell, and finally the murder of Mary Clifford at the hands of Elizabeth Brownrigg. Now, as I've mentioned, the Brownrigg family were becoming quite prosperous. In fact, the description is they'd earned enough money to have country lodgings at the village of Islington at the north of London, where they could retire of a weekend and take the country air, escape the smoky air and the pollution of London. Now, Elizabeth Brownrigg was doing very well too. She was very busy with her midwife business. So she had taken on first 1, then 2 foundling apprentices. They were taken on as apprentice domestic servants, both girls being very young, I think 14 years of age. Now, for the first month, as they were taken on for approval, they were both treated fairly well, allowed to wear their own clothes. They were fed, watered, and not worked too hard. But once they were accepted as these domestic apprentices, things changed. And they changed dramatically for the worse. Now, these 2 young apprentice girls from the workhouse, you have Mary Jones and Mary Mitchell. Now, don't forget how young they are, around about 14 years of age, probably illiterate and under strength. They are now at the mercy of the Brownrigg family. They are fed scraps off the plates of the Brownriggs when they have finished their main meal. They are kept in filthy conditions and they worked quite hard. But it's what happens to Mary Jones that we have to focus on. You see, James Brownrigg and his son, John, they bully her. And as a result of this, she is slapped and punched by Elizabeth Brownrigg and called a filthy slut. Mary Jones receives the full attention of Elizabeth Brownrigg. She is stripped of her own clothes, put into lice-ridden rags, and worked doing domestic chores for 18 hours a day, and then only given a mat on the kitchen floor, the cold kitchen floor, to sleep upon. What's happening to this young girl is disgraceful, but the worst is yet to come. Now, Mary Jones, when she incurred the displeasure of Elizabeth Brownrigg, she'd be beaten, and beaten quite savagely. So she tried to escape several times, and each time she was captured, stripped naked, placed across 2 chairs, and then beaten with a whip. She was beaten so much it only stopped when Elizabeth Brownrigg needed a rest. Now, it was at this time that they discovered that Mary Jones was afraid of water. So Elizabeth Brownrigg would actually plunge her head into a pail of water and hold her head down almost to the point of drowning, and then lifted it up. This, a little bit later on, became a favourite pastime not only of hers, but of her husbands, James, and their son, John, who apparently these 2 men abused poor old Mary in other ways too. It doesn't go into detail, but it just mentions that they abused her in other ways. And one of their fun things to do was when poor old Mary was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor, they would pull her legs from behind her, creeping up on her, pulling her legs, and then plunging her head into the pail of filthy, disgusting water and holding it there to the point of drowning. Their favourite pastime. But this young girl, Mary Jones, she was tough, and she made several attempts to escape. But she was learning each time. The windows were barred. The doors were locked. She was forced to sleep under a dresser, actually in the Brownriggs' bedroom. But very early one morning, she crept downstairs. She knew where they hung the key to the front door. She unlocked it and slipped out. The problem she had, she didn't know where she was. She'd only been from the Foundling Hospital to the Brownriggs' house once. She begged passer-by to help her, and a peddler took her to the Foundling Hospital, where she was examined by the surgeon. When Mary Jones was examined by the surgeon at the Foundling Hospital, she was found to be covered all over her body with cuts and bruises, and one of her eyes, she was blind. What had happened is her head had been jammed into a bucket. It had cut the eye, which had then been left untreated and had become infected, and she was now blind. The governors of the hospital were informed of her injuries and what had taken place. They then informed their solicitor, Mr. Plumtree, to write a letter. It was 24th of July, 1765, demanding to know the cause of the injuries and threatening prosecution, but the Brownriggs simply ignored the letter. No further action was taken except to notify them that Mary Jones' apprenticeship had been terminated. Poor old Mary Mitchell now has been left in the Brownrigg household, where she suffered persistent cruelty, not just from Elizabeth Brownrigg, the mother, but also her husband James and her son John. But after about a year, she managed to escape. But of course, these girls didn't quite know where they were. And she was seen on the street by the Brownriggs' youngest son, Billy, who took hold of her and dragged her back to the house. In view of this now, they tightened up security. She was confined to the house and severely beaten for trying to escape. Ironically, on the 18th of February 1766, Mary Clifford was allocated to the Brownrigg household as an apprentice, a domestic servant. This was by the overseers of the White Friars precinct. Now, At first, she was treated quite well. We would call this period, like a month or 2 months, approval, probationary period. In those days, it was called upon liking. So after a month, if you liked her, you then signed her on as an apprentice. Now, at first, Mary was treated quite nicely, but as soon as she was accepted upon liking, then the insults rained down on her. She was beaten regularly, stripped naked of her clothes, starved, and then kept short of water. She began to wet the bed, basically. Now, I can understand that. The shock of what she's now going through must have been awful for the poor lass. So she was not allowed to sleep on a bed. She was forced to sleep in the coal hole, and it must have been terrible for her. But at one stage, she was so desperate for water that she broke a plank that covered the water butt, so I understand, to try and get a drink. For this, she was severely punished. The cruelty towards Mary Clifford increases, and it wasn't just the beatings. Elizabeth Brownrigg fastens a chain around the neck of young Mary, which is then fastened to the yard door. It's almost strangling her. She's got work to do in the yard, but they have to extend the chain so she could actually pull forward. It was literally almost strangling her. Now, that night, when she's thrown into the coal hole and locked in, the chain was still fastened heavily around her neck, and her hands were fastened behind her back. Now, both Marys at one stage were suspended by a rope from a water pipe that ran across the ceiling of the scullery, and they were beaten mercilessly. But Elizabeth, who was doing the beatings, was concerned that the water pipe they were fastened to might fracture. So she had her husband screw in a hook into a wooden beam that ran across the ceiling of the scullery, not too close to the walls. It was so the girls were suspended freely and just hanging by their own body weight so they could be beaten. Now, the son, the eldest son, John, he would actually take over the beatings of the girls from the mother when Elizabeth became exhausted. But there was another cruel streak in John. When he used to pick on Mary Clifford, he wanted a tester bed, which is quite a heavy half-sized bed, moved. And he got Mary Clifford to do it, but she was so malnourished, so weak, she couldn't move it. So he beat her, kicked her, pushed her, and abused her trying to move this bed. This just goes to show that both the husband, James, and the son were complicit in the torture of these poor girls. The cruelty inflicted on Mary Clifford continues, but you know that young lass managed to tell one of the lodgers what was happening to her. This lodger was a French lady, but Mary was so terrified that she made the lodger, this French lady, we don't know her name, promise that she would not say anything to Elizabeth Brownrigg. However, later there was a blazing row between the French woman and Elizabeth Brownrigg, and the French woman blurted out, "We know what you're doing to your servant girls." Well, in revenge, Elizabeth Brownrigg fetches a pair of scissors and she shouts, "I'll stop your tattling," and then pulls her tongue out and cuts it twice. Can you imagine the pain? Have you ever bitten your tongue, how painful it is, how sore? Now this poor lass has got 2 actual cuts into her tongue. And then it's followed up and he says, "You do that again, I'll cut your entire tongue out." Then on the 13th of July, 1767, in the presence of Mary Mitchell, Elizabeth Brownrigg suspended Mary Clifford from the ceiling, stripping her naked, and then beat her so bad that blood dripped down her body off her toes and began to pool on the floor. Mary Mitchell describes how she saw scabs from previous wounds being opened up. These beatings were repeated 5 times that day. The day before these terrible beatings of Mary Clifford, her stepmother is at Whitefriars making inquiries as to the whereabouts of her stepdaughter. She's directed to the Brownrigg's house and she speaks to James Brownrigg. "Where's my stepdaughter?" He denies all knowledge of the whereabouts of poor Mary. And then he becomes abusive when he's pressed, when he's questioned. So the stepmother, as she's leaving, is taken to one side by Mrs. Deaking, the next door neighbour. She's the wife of the baker there, who tells her, listen, we've heard groaning and screaming coming from next door. So what we'll do for you, both my husband and I, we'll keep an eye out, an ear out, and if we spot anything, hear anything, we'll be in touch. So addresses were exchanged, and away the stepmother goes. After the confrontation with Mary Clifford's stepmother, James Brownrigg makes his way to Hampstead and buys what was known as the Christmas pig. You buy it a few months before Christmas, fatten it up, it's slaughtered, that's for your Christmas feast. Now, what they used to do with these pigs, they would have a pig pen in the backyard. It would be totally enclosed, but the Brownriggs had taken the skylight off the top to allow the stench to escape. And it was the next door neighbours, the deacon's servant, who was William Clipson. He had seen a crumpled heap inside the pig pen. The alarm is raised, but the deacons asked the servant, can he crawl out onto the roof? Can he get a better look? And he does this, and he can see clearly there is a person. He throws some mortar, some bits of stone down, trying to see if the person would move. Eventually, piece hits the head of the girl. She turns her head painfully up and just groans. The alarm now truly is raised. Now, the neighbour of the Brownriggs, Mrs. Deakin, fetches Mary Clifford's stepmother, and together they go and see the overseers of the St Dunstan's parish. That's a Mr. Grundy, and they explain what's happening. So the three of them now go down to the Brownriggs' house. Along the way, they must have collected the servant boy from next door, because what happens now is brilliant, because James Brownrigg is belligerent. He's really angry. He's delaying. He goes in and he fetches out the wrong Mary, Mary Mitchell. But William Coulson, the young servant from next door, says, no, that's not the girl that was in the pig pen. She had short red hair. Immediately, a constable was called, and together with the constable, Mr. Grundy, they made a search of the Brownriggs' house, but they failed to find the girl. She was so well concealed. And even though James Brownrigg was so angry, Mr. Grundy took control of Mary Mitchell. She was removed from the scene. The overseers at the workhouse, they began to see the extent of her injuries. Now, when Mary began to remove her tattered leather bodice, she actually really did scream out. It was then they saw the seeping lacerations that were sticking to the inside of her bodice that were making her scream. They reassured Mary. They promised that she would not be returning to the Brownriggs' house. When she heard this, she relaxed a little bit and she began to tell the overseers the extent of what had been going on at the Brownriggs' house. She confirmed that Mary Clifford had been kept in the pig pen, but had been removed just before the search began because she had seen her on the stairs. Determined to rescue Mary Clifford, Mr. Grundy fetched reinforcements and confronted James Brownrigg that they were going to make a thorough search of the house. And they then summoned a coach because they were going to arrest Mr. Brownrigg on suspicion of murder. When he heard that he may be taken to the lockup, he says, look, just give me half an hour and I will produce the girl, which they did. Now notice that, give me half an hour. These are delaying tactics. Eventually, Mary Clifford was produced. She'd been hidden in a cupboard under a cabinet in the dining room. When they saw her appalling state, the bruises, the fresh bleeding, the lacerations, and the septic wounds, they were horrified. Immediately, John Brownrigg was arrested and taken to jail. But whilst he'd been stalling the authorities, Elizabeth and her son John Brownrigg had actually made good their escape. Meanwhile, both girls were examined by a doctor at the workhouse, after which they were conveyed to the Guildhall where the Lord Mayor wanted to question them. Now, Mary Clifford was so weak she couldn't walk the short distance to see the Lord Mayor, so she was conveyed in a sedan chair. After this, they were taken to St Bartholomew's Hospital for treatment. Unfortunately, on the 9th of August 1767, Mary Clifford would die from her injuries. A coroner's court was then summoned, and there was a verdict that Mary Clifford had been willfully murdered, and charges were laid against James and Elizabeth Brownrigg and their son, John. So, Elizabeth and her son, John Brownrigg, had actually had it on their toes. They'd escaped, but they'd gone via Petticoat Lane, where they purchased some different clothing. They disguised themselves. They took lodgings down in Wandsworth. They got a room upstairs in this lodging house. Now, the landlord recognised John when he came downstairs for a light for the candle. He saw him full length. Now, he had seen a picture of them in the local newspaper, so he reported it to the constables. The constables come down, they go upstairs, and they make the arrest. Now, when they went into the room, Elizabeth was sat by the bed, and her son, John, was walking up and down in the room. She was well disguised, had a straw hat and all different kinds of stuff. He, John, was wearing a livery coat. Not even the neighbours who saw them come out of the lodging house said we wouldn't have recognised them. They were so well disguised. But now we have James, Elizabeth and John. They have all been arrested. So the news was out. Crowds were now gathering outside the mansion house because they'd heard that Elizabeth Brownrigg and her son John were due there to be questioned by the Lord Mayor. But however, what happened was all Sunday night and into Monday, Elizabeth Brownrigg was having convulsions and couldn't be questioned. So the Lord Mayor obtained a warrant from the coroner's court, and Elizabeth was actually incarcerated in Newgate Prison. Her son John, however, was sent to a different jail. So the trial was held at the Old Bailey in London on the 11th September 1767. All three of the Brownriggs, Elizabeth, her husband James and her son John, pleaded not guilty to the vicious murder of poor old Mary Clifford. Now, the main witness for the prosecution was Mary Mitchell, and she was a brave girl. She stood there in the middle of that court, the Old Bailey, don't forget, in front of a bench of her betters and the vicious glare of Elizabeth Brownrigg, and she gave evidence. She described the treatment to both her and her friend, poor old Mary Clifford, how the hook had been put into the beam to hang them both so they could be whipped, and they had no support. They would actually be whipped and would swing under their own body weight. She described all of the proceedings, what they were actually whipped with: sticks, whips, and the horse whip that belonged to James, that was fetched from the stables to be used both as a whip and as the other end as a kind of a cudgel. She also described how one day Elizabeth Brownrigg got so angry with Mary herself, Mary Mitchell, that she grasped her head in her hands and then pushed her thumbs into Mary's eyes and then pulled the eyelids down across her cheeks so viciously that her eyes actually bled. Both the doctors and the coroner gave evidence at the trial, and the doctor recounted how he couldn't count the amount of wounds that she had on her body. Some of them were old and were festering. He could tell that a thin whip had been used to lash around Mary Clifford's legs, but the worst wound was upon her hip, and it was as wide as the palm of your hand. It was open and untreated. Her head had 6 wounds in it. Her throat was extremely swollen. Now, that had been from when the chain had been wrapped around her neck. Now, both girls were described as emaciated and starving. Amazingly, at the trial, many people came forward to give positive character references with regard to the Brownriggs, and they denied the charges all the way through the trial, and they gave alternative reasons as to why things happened. One of those was that poor old Mary Clifford volunteered to sleep in the coal hole because of her bedwetting habits. However, an extra witness was called. He was an apprentice to James Brownrigg. That's George Benham. And he was witness to Mary Clifford actually being beaten by Elizabeth Brownrigg with the horsewhip. He gave evidence as to how he was ordered to take Mary Clifford down into the coal hole and lock her up. He describes how she was naked except for stockings and shoes upon her feet. As he was about to lock her up, she turned to him and said, "Could you get me some of my old clothes to cover up?" And he said, "You know where they are?" And she said, "Yes." So he allowed her to nip out quickly. And she found an old bit of carpet and a bit of blanket. So she got somewhere to sleep on and somewhere to cover her body. Now, I'm going to go to the evidence that this young apprentice actually gave. I'm going to read it out. And it says, it really did make his heart ache to lock her up with this nakedness. And he was asked, "Did you see her back?" And he said, "No. I turned my head away and would not look at her." And they said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "I thought she'd have some cuts from the beating, and my heart really ached." After 11 hours of hearing all of the evidence, the jury deliberated for only 15 minutes, and they found Elizabeth Brownrigg guilty of willful murder. She will hang at Tyburn gallows. However, her husband, James Brownrigg, and their son, John, were acquitted. But they were remanded in custody, and they were found guilty of assaulting Mary Mitchell. And they were each given a custodial sentence. In other words, they were sent to prison for 6 months, and they were fined 1 shilling. I did read that this may have been because it was an all-male jury, and they reckoned as these 2 men were not present at the final beating of Mary Clifford, they were not guilty of the murder. Even at the very end, Elizabeth Brownrigg did not consider herself guilty of the murder of Mary Clifford, but she was executed at Tyburn on the 14th of September 1767. The crowds that lined the 3-mile route from Newgate to Tyburn were vicious. They hated her. Everybody knew what she had done. They hurled abuse and other things at her. She went to her death and everybody cheered, "Hooray, hooray," as she dangled there. But due to the Murder Act of 1751, her body was to be taken from her place of execution to the dissecting tables, where tickets to watch her body being cut from flesh down to bone were like gold dust. Her skeleton was placed in a niche at Surgeons' Hall. But what gets me is this is an infamous murder, and Elizabeth Brownrigg is remembered for it. And I feel that it's unjust because her victims, Mary Clifford, Mary Mitchell, and Mary Jones, are largely forgotten in history. Well, I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can have a look at joining our Patreon community. The link is in the description. Now, before I go, quick shout out to some of my Patreon members. I've written it down so I get it right. Tyler Heather, Patrick Chandler, and Tony Southwell. Well, guys, thanks a million. Without your support, I couldn't do this. Bye for now.